Welcome to the Xylem Group on Blab. Today we're going to be talking about reasonable interpretation. Joining me are Sherry Jennings in Washington, USA. Linda Steer, I believe you're in North Carolina today, USA. And John Bruce in the UK. Reasonable interpretation is something that people who study policy governance talk a great deal about because we give those to whom we delegate the right of reasonable interpretation of our policies. However, I think reasonable interpretation is a good concept for anybody who delegates using policies. Would any of you agree with me on that?
Yes.
John?
Mm-hmm. I would.
And why would you agree with me?
Because it's reasonable.
It's a reasonable interpretation.
Well, could somebody define reasonable interpretation? How were we using it in this context?
Well, I would say I'll start off by just saying reasonable, having some fair, sensible, sound judgment that any reasonable person, any one of, there would be a modicum of would be accepted by a large number of people coming from a very moderate, fair and sensible perspective, and interpretation being that which can be gleaned from what got spoken. And I would say also that it would be inside the intent from which it was first delivered. So there's something that has some fair, sensible, judged furthering or expanding from the intention of something that's initially spoken or delivered.
So we're really talking about the reasonable interpretation of someone's policy. Is that right?
Well, yeah. But
it's someone speaking.
It's how the policy looks in actual operational terms. So normally when you're delegating to someone, and I always use when lawmakers pass a law, that's a policy, but they're not the ones who actually cause it to come into being as an actual workable, part of our community. It's delegated to some people who cause it to happen, and they interpret what the law says. And often you get very different interpretations. So it really depends on, being able to monitor that, how people have interpreted what's going on. I know in our case here in our community, for example, if you want to build a house, you have to go to the county, and there are all kinds of laws that govern how you can build and where you can build and what you can build and all that sort of thing. But how it's interpreted by the people who actually run that office can be quite different from one to the next. So often you're told, well, if you don't get a good answer for the first try, go and see if you can get another person and you might get a better answer. So, reasonableness is often different from one person to the next. So it's an important concept.
But it does have force before the law, doesn't it? In other words, what a reasonable person will do is something that a judge could agree with or disagree with if a law was broken as a result of poor and an unreasonable interpretation. Am I correct?
Well, I think there is always a test of reasonableness that needs to be applied. And in the UK, we refer to how would the man on the top of the Clapham omnibus, who is of course a reasonable person, how would he or she, I guess, interpret that? So we try and conjure up the idea of an ordinary citizen, a reasonable citizen, and how would they interpret this decision? Call it a policy if you will, but there's a decision somewhere that is to be acted upon, and how will the person acting on it interpret that decision? So is it reasonable? Is the interpretation a reasonable one? And I guess if we follow the line that we've been covering so far. It's how would most people view that? Well, I think one of the difficulties with that is it depends where you are. And most people in the UK, for example, may interpret something in one way, but most people in the Ukraine or Belarus or Milwaukee or High Street Hoboken may interpret it very differently. So that becomes then a question, I think, of whose interpretation is more reasonable. And that, of course, is where Supreme Courts have so much fun, I guess. and lawyers make more money.
That's true.
But the question of what reasonable or not would probably work whether you're in Belarus or Cleveland. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
In other
Yes.
words, the person in Belarus might interpret it differently, but it would still have to be reasonable, and
Yes.
the people of Belarus would agree, and so would the people in Cleveland, that the interpretation of that person was reasonable or not.
Yes.
Well, I think the other aspect of this to bring in, right? So if we just look at reasonable interpretation as reasonable interpretation, looking at it from a global standpoint, but we're talking about it as a construct of a vehicle in a particular setting, right? Because if you think about it, I mean, people could argue, which is the case, right? So if you're I'm picking up on what Sherry said, is that under what conditions would you even want to consider this kind of construct of reasonable interpretation? That there is in the passing of a law or a policy or a board, but there's some entity that's speaking to say, here's this policy or here's this law. And that if we look at the dynamics of it, who does the speaking becomes the adjudicator as to what the interpretation of what it is that they've spoken, right? So everybody could have their opinion, and everybody tends to have their opinion about what's happening globally, but it actually doesn't make any difference other than what we're saying. We've got somebody speaking. They're the adjudicator of who they're speaking to. Is the fulfillment of what they're speaking in the arena of what they would consider to be reasonable, and who it is that they're delegating and speaking to becomes the entity or the party that needs to demonstrate back that, by the way, here's how I've interpreted this. Here's what this would actually look like in the world from what you've spoken. And here's the case for why that's reasonable, whether they're demonstrating the reasonable person test, or they're referencing some accepted standard or accepted agency that has some standard it's within those guidelines, so therefore we're declaring this reasonable. So it isn't up to just arbitrary adjudication either. So I just wanted to kind of add what's the framework inside of which we're speaking about this. And then, why would we do that, right?
I mean, I think that's enormously helpful, Linda. But my point is that there are different frameworks. So there are frameworks in which the kind of behaviour that many of us would disapprove of would be considered perfectly reasonable, and I think that's a real challenge for Supreme Courts, for example, and international courts, for example, at The Hague. In deciding, even though it may have seemed reasonable in your country, Mr. Smith, to have behaved in the way in which you have, we believe on balance it was unreasonable across the jurisdiction of many, many countries. And they need to set out their thinking as ever. And I think it's hugely important that the thinking needs to be explained, not just someone arbitrarily saying, well, my interpretation is that that's wrong, so we shouldn't do it, or my interpretation is that that's right. You have to be able to explain it, justify it, rationalize it, for others to be able to agree with it or not, as the case may be. And so for me, the jurisdiction in which you're operating is quite important. It's not so much a legal point of view as you are a corporate organization, but you may operate in many countries. So what is reasonable in one country? Is it reasonable in all countries? And is it reasonable to the corporation at large? Which I think is a really difficult situation for any multinational chief executive.
Mm-hmm. But that's where it matters, doesn't it? It may seem not reasonable to me that there are the armchair critics that are around the world for something happening. And oftentimes people from the armchair, determining what's right, wrong, or indifferent about what's happening, it really doesn't matter what they say about it. All that matters is within the jurisdiction in which it's operating, because that's where the accountability is.
Yeah.
Well, let's look a little bit at the policy aspect, because what we're really talking about, I think, is the reasonable interpretation of policy. And I know that as people who teach and participate in using policy governance, we look at policy as something that the board does. But as somebody who's been a supervisor and a consultant, I have used policy at other levels in the organization. And the concept of reasonable interpretation is really important, I think. A lot of people hear policy and they think of policy in a negative sense, what you're not supposed to do, what you have to be careful of. Oh, we need to have a policy about whistleblowers. We need to have a policy about conflict of interest. Well, that's all very well. But long before I heard of policy governance, I was hired by somebody who said, I want to enable my employees to do the things that I need them to do without asking permission. I want them to know the scope of what's available to them. And he said, I think I can do this by writing policies. Can you help me with that? And I thought this was an amazingly liberating process. And I'll give you an example. I've done a fair amount of work over the years with tourism organizations, and in that case, you really want to have people be welcoming. You want people to go the extra mile for the customer, and you want them to do it enthusiastically. And I can remember one person explaining to me, not a client of mine, but a colleague, that their research showed that if you could solve somebody's problem 50% of the time or better, that person will do business with you again. That's all very nice. So you solve people's problems. Be prepared to do that. He said, but our research shows something else. If you can solve somebody's problem on the spot, not, oh, I'll have to talk to my manager about that, or I'll get back to you, or somebody will get back to you. But if you can solve somebody's problem on the spot, over 90% of people will do business again with you. In other words, if somebody has a problem, this is an opportunity to secure somebody's business, maybe forever. So they had a policy there, and I think that the reasonable interpretation was too broad, but they said not only is the customer always right, but anything is possible. But you understand that other organizations have done this. Many years ago, Ritz-Carlton Hotel told their employees, you have $2,000 to spend to solve clients' problems on the spot, no questions asked. And this is everybody. This is the people who are carrying the luggage, the people who are making up the rooms. And does it work? I can remember being in the hotel manager's office some years ago when he would, the manager of the hotel is just gloating. This is one of Vancouver's high-end hotels. And he said, today we had somebody, it was one of those days when you couldn't get a cab in Vancouver for anything. Some event was going on. And there was somebody desperate to get to the hotel. And one of the people in the front office said, I'll take you. Not, I'll charge you, I'll do anything. Just, I will take you. And the general manager said, that's what I want. So the purpose of that kind of policy is to enable people to think beyond what they would normally do, to empower them to do things. And so that employee's reasonable interpretation of the values that the boss held were really important. If the boss had articulated it maybe better, more people would do those things. But the boss has to articulate it and then communicate it. And that's where the policy comes from, isn't it?
Well,
And then the reasonable interpretation is, does somebody abuse this, or can they interpret it reasonably? Have I gone on too long here? But what I'm trying to open this up to is the idea that policy enables people, and that reasonable interpretation means that they don't run amok with that.
well, isn't it about, though, the organization being able to clearly articulate its values? And I'll give you a good example is Southwest Airlines saying the customer comes first. You know, we care about our employers, we care about our customers, we want everything to go well. And the example of how this worked was 9/11, and all of the planes were grounded and not necessarily at the destination that was intended. And so, of course, Southwest was, you know, doing diligence and going around and checking with the customers who had been put up at hotels and making sure everything was okay. And so their customer service people called this one hotel, I think it was in Dallas or Houston, where these people had been waylaid. And no one was there. None of the customers were in their rooms. So this guy desperately calls the front desk and said, what's going on? He said, oh, the pilot took them all to lunch or to dinner and a movie. I mean, you know, that's the way it's supposed to work, you know. So it's about articulating those values in such a way that people get it, and they know that not only are they liberated to do something, but they can use their own initiative and do what it takes to help people feel better about what's going on. And let's hope Delta has a similar policy.
Sherry, I love that story, because not only does that communicate to the staff as to how they're supposed to behave, but it communicates to the whole world, doesn't it? Here you are telling this story, and it's been years since I've been on a Southwest Airlines flight, but the next time I have the opportunity, I'm going to feel really good about them because of the story you just told. But have they articulated that? Do you know what the policy is?
Yeah.
Obviously, the value is communicated.
So one of my favorite quotes is this one. And I'd like for us to talk a little bit about how important the words are that you use in policy. Robert McCloskey said, I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant.
You actually said that very well. That's an easy one to mess up, isn't it?
Yes. And I use that a lot because when boards of directors particularly are writing policy, I mean, the template is wonderful, but if the words don't mean anything to them, then they're not going to mean anything to anyone else. And it's one of my favorite examples is the Revised Code of Washington, the state I'm in, is RCW. And I was reviewing this for a client at one point, and I was reading through all this blah, 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 mumbo jumbo, blah, 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 that none of it made any sense to me whatsoever. And then at the very bottom, it said, what the legislators intended by this is in 3 clear sentences. And I was like, why don't you just write it that way to begin with? You know, why follow the legalese template and the wording that just because it sounds good or because it sounds important? No, it needs to be meaningful. The words are important.
Oh, well, I'm just going to tag on to that, Sherry. I love that, you know, and if you're looking to effectively, you know, how do you most efficiently and effectively produce a result? Then, given before we started today, your term from your meeting this morning of bloviate, right, is to just wildly and verbosely talk or speak. It just generally tends to be just streams of consciousness. And what does it take for someone, right? If you're wanting to accomplish something, you imagine some laws go on for pages and pages and pages. What does it take for someone to mine through that? And the very broad, when something's not distinct and succinct, then you've got this broad range of interpretation that you've got to wind yourself through, and it just creates way more work. You know, if you can be do the work, which requires work on the part of the person speaking or the policy or the law, that the amount of work that it takes on the front end to synthesize all of the ideas and what could be written, to actually bring it down to what you're succinctly saying is the scope of what we're going to allow to happen, the efficiency that drives down through the system.
So how would you rewrite the 10 Commandments?
Oh my gosh, John.
They are, for me, one of the most powerful sets of statements ever. And this is not about faith. This is simply about values, simply, if that's the right word. And they have the strength of simplicity. Now, I suspect that whoever drafted those things, whoever he or she was, had several goes at it before they came up with the eventual 10. That would be my contemporaneous interpretation of the drafting of the 10 Commandments. But if you had the opportunity to revise them, could you make a serious improvement to any of those? I'm not asking what other commandments there should be, but just take 2 or 3 commandments.
I don't know that
They're not really commandments, though, either.
would. I mean,
they're
idea of interpretation in mind. Yeah. Yeah, as a limitation. That I agree. That'd be one way. But
they have this enormously powerful aspect to them. If you take, for example, thou shalt not kill. If you were to kill, under what circumstances would it be okay? And your interpretation would need to reflect that, I would have thought. So is it okay to kill in self-defense? And if so, then why don't the commandments say so? Well, it's because they're limitations, they're not interpretations, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're. Go ahead.
My big problem with people trying to say that limitations ought to be framed in the positive is just that, John. They don't say you should try really hard not to kill anybody, or you should try really hard to make sure people live well and don't get hurt or maimed. That's not what they say. They say don't kill anybody.
I agree.
So,
well, I think the other thing that is fabulous, John, about raising that, the 10 Commandments as here's a set of values. And this is great inside this discussion, because if I think about the commandments, right, and that particular one of thou shalt not kill, in reality, there's a lot of killing happening in the world. Now, it says that thou shalt not kill. You have to deal with, I mean, what it has me confront is that there is killing happening, even though I may not be the one doing it. I by not saying anything or actually dealing with that there's some consequence about how are we going to eliminate that or continue to abide by the thou shalt not kill, then I can be considered somewhat complicit in the whole deal. But it has, whether something is getting fulfilled or not inside of that. I don't know that an interpretation would be that, okay, well, you can kill under X, Y, and Z because that's what we're doing. Or no, we're saying that you don't. And of the times when it does happen, you need to account and deal with it, as with anything else in the violation of a policy, right? But what I'm hearing in that there's a moral compass for any organization when they create this set of values, that this is what we're abiding by, and not that the interpretation is giving you some leeway inside of that, but it is giving the bounds under which you now need to keep aligning yourself. The guideposts that you need to, you need to keep orienting yourself around that value.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
The question that you raised, John, was how would you rewrite them?
Mhm.
And I think that the test of reasonable interpretation is where you would begin. You would take one of those lines, "Thou shalt not kill," if you like, and you ask the question: Is what is a reasonable interpretation of this? And you explore the range of it and see if it is clear the way it stands, or if you need to say any more. And what I'm hearing from Linda is maybe more needs to be said. Maybe there are situations where you would be forgiven for killing somebody if you were going to be killed. On the other hand, if you believe in life eternal and being killed may not be such a bad thing. So you need to look at the value that this is being that is being expressed here, who is expressing it, and how much you care about that person's or that individual's or that entity's values. But the test, and I think that's what's important to our conversation, the test of reasonable interpretation isn't just for the person to whom the policy is being directed, the delegatee. It is also a useful tool to use when you write policy. You write the policy and then you say, well, what's a reasonable interpretation? What's the scope of what we have just said? And I think that's really useful for boards and for managers who are writing policy to look at the words they've written, because it's very possible and it's quite usual for people to examine an issue to make the words become more and more succinct till eventually the only people who really understand the words are those who wrote them. But when you ask what's a reasonable interpretation of this, you begin to explore the scope of what you've just said with your words, and then discover if you need more words.
What was going through my mind, Robert, if I understand you right, is that it's of course not the board's interpretation that matters here, it's the delegatee's interpretation. And the board can think and discuss and kick around all kinds of interpretations, but if the delegatee comes up with one they hadn't considered, they nevertheless have to ask the question, despite the fact that we didn't think about it, is it reasonable? And I think that's really tough when they've already done some testing of their own understanding and interpretation of the policy or the decision. And
well, the question, John, now, because I want to hear your reaction to this. The question that the leader, meaning the board chair or the consultant or the manager who is drafting the policy, asks is, will we be satisfied with any reasonable interpretation of this policy? So that question means let's examine the scope of where this can go. Now,
sure.
People will always surprise you, but the question is, was that a reasonable interpretation? Not was it a fanciful interpretation? Was it an ironic interpretation, or was it a funny interpretation? But was it reasonable? And I find that usually brings people down to earth.
Yep.
Well,
go ahead.
I think you brought this up, Linda, about what credible evidence do you have to support that what you said was a reasonable interpretation is a reasonable interpretation? I mean, it becomes less subjective and more objective when you can add some outside expert third-party data to it. So I think you brought that up, Linda.
Yeah.
Recognizing, of course, that there are interesting differences among experts on things.
Of course.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Choose your expert.
Yes, indeed. I only choose the ones I think are right.
Yeah.
Which comes back to there. It's never absolute, is it? That it comes back to that when you're, if I had the exact same interpretation of something, and I'm either in one context with one person who's delegated this to me, and what would they have as reasonable? I would come up with the evidence for that. It might come up with different evidence for that same interpretation to somebody else, depending on what they're going to hear, right? So I was just thinking about the commandments and the thou shalt not kill and the precision of language. And so I just had this thought, why not just simply do not kill? Is there any difference? Shall not, must not, or don't. Do not.
Sherry?
I don't know. I don't know if there is any difference there. I quite like the thou in terms of it kind of it's pointing at you. Do not kill. Thou shalt not kill. But
There's a difference as to one shouldn't or don't do it.
Well, the thou part of it refers presumably to a human being. It is spoken language. It is in language. It wasn't in English originally, but it was spoken from one entity to another cogent entity. When in fact the world has a lot of killing going on. Nature's half acre is well known for its fang and claw and survival of the fittest. So the world is very much a place where killing goes on, but you hear the Judeo-Christian God saying to the followers, you people whom I created, do not do this. That's what I'm hearing. So it's quite specific. The thou, I think, is not God talking to the mountain lion and to the other predators, the orca that swim by here on Bowen Island. The thou, I think, is referring specifically to the followers of the related religions.
it's also tricky to challenge a god, isn't it? Whereas in our respective places, our worlds and boards, for example, a delegatee can say to the board, "Hold on a minute, do you really mean this?" But it's kind of tricky saying that to God unless you happen to be of particular persuasion, which I'm not sure I am. And of course, that in a sense is the underlying essence, I think, of the whole value system, that you have to make up your mind about what you think is reasonable.
Well, speaking to one of the leaders of one of the large faith groups in Canada, I was concerned about this because they had described God as one of their owners, which is a policy governance concept, and I couldn't resist. Maybe it was my sense of humor, but I couldn't resist asking him, how can you link with your owners in this regard? And without even blinking, he looked at me and said, "It's easy, Robert. We ask, then we wait for the answer." And he said, "We always get it." Pardon me, but so there.
Yeah, that's and yet, of course, there has to be an and yet. I'm also assured that God does not intervene on our planet. God does not take action to prevent awful things happening. God does not intervene.
One of my favorite and very trite jokes is the one about the very devout man who prays to God every day to win the lottery. "Oh God, please let me win the lottery. Oh, please let me win the lottery." Every day, devoutly he prays, "Please, God." Finally, one day, the skies break loose and the lightning bolts flash, and God says, "Meet me halfway and buy a ticket already."
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, only we can bring religion into the whole context of policy governance and reasonable
Well,
interpretation.
which is another
That's great.
religion, of course. Yeah.
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 Final
I didn't
final
expect the conversation to
adjudication.
go in that direction.
Hmm.
But we have talked about policy. We have mentioned policy is an expression of values. So presumably, people and supervisors and even boards have values that they sometimes don't express. But we teach it's a good idea if you want people to understand your values to express them, and that really is the essence of policy itself. Reasonable interpretation strikes me as a useful tool. What are we missing here in this discussion? What do we need to explore with regard to reasonable interpretation?
I think I don't know if we need to explore it, but I think a clear given is that the person to whom you are delegating is somebody whom you believe will make a reasonable interpretation. And therefore the whole process of hiring, recruiting and educating and so on cannot be overlooked. So that, whilst I say it's a given, I think it's quite an important given, and it's not one to take lightly. If 3 chief executives were hired by 3 similar organizations and given similar policies, would they all interpret them the same way? Don't know. We haven't tested that, but it would be interesting to see. And if they didn't, what would be the differences and would they matter? So this whole notion of interpretation is the most absolute thing that I can think of, because it's perfectly reasonable to be different from everyone else, I think.
Well, here's a situation, John, and anybody else that I see coming up, actually not infrequently. The board writes a policy. And there I am talking to the CEO, who is the delegate in this case. And the delegate, he says, well, this is an interesting policy, but they haven't told me enough. I need to go back and ask them for more information. And I'm usually in the position of saying, no, you don't. The board has said all it wants to say. You have the right of reasonable interpretation. What they've done is given you a lot of scope. Take that scope. And it's interesting how often people are given policy that gives them a great deal of scope, and then they don't want that. They really want the boss, the board in this case, to restrict their actions and be more specific. And I say, no, don't do that. Use your imagination. He said, well, under this policy, I could go ahead and do the following. And I usually wait until he says, I can do that, can't I? And I said, yeah. And I think that's what the board wants you to do, is to be able to think that way. Do any of you see this kind of a situation arise?
All the time. All the time. Because I think in many ways, we grow up learning to respect boundaries and I think in all cultures, parents kind of parent by setting boundaries. Rather than telling their kids what to do. They set a lot of boundaries and we're comfortable with those. And we're very comfortable with boundaries. I think the problem that most in policy governance, I think the problem that really comes is when you try to balance what the board said it wants to have happen over here versus what it said in its commandments, or thou shalt nots. And that's where the limiting factors arise. That's where you begin to realize that there are some boundaries that you need to work within. And so often people forget that that's what you have to look at. You have to look at both sides of that. And yeah, I mean, you could reasonably interpret that this means go out there and do whatever you want, anytime you want to do it, and in any way. But no, that's why we say there's a limit to the way that you can achieve what we've asked you to do. And so I think I have to keep reminding, especially younger people who are younger executives, there's a balance. There are two policy areas governing what your behavior for a reason. And you need to look at those and think about it in the context of that, because there are all kinds of things about how you treat people, how you manage the organization in terms of financial responsibility, having long-range plans, having all kinds of things that are there. But yes, you're granted a lot of freedom in between.
When I was doing that work for the organization on policy, long before I heard policy governance, it's interesting because kind of automatically those issues came up where there was boundaries. They wanted to have policies to know where the boundaries were, and it was interesting to negotiate those. And I had the boss saying, I want people to have the freedom to go and do these things that we need the organization to do without asking for permission. And it took me a while to understand how really important that was in an organization. So what I'm hearing from you folks is articulating your values is really important, but also not just talking about what you want to achieve, but you've also got to make it clear those boundaries within which people operate. We generally talk about that as ethics and prudence. We assume that that's where the boundaries are going to be, is in ethical behavior and in prudent behavior. Are there any other things?
Well, Stalin's ghost appears to Putin in a dream, and Putin asks for his help running the country. Stalin says, round up and shoot all the Democrats, and then paint the inside of the Kremlin blue. Why blue? Putin asks. Ha, says Stalin, I knew you wouldn't ask me about the first part.
Very good.
Sorry for that distraction.
No, I like it.
It's very good.
And what it does is point out how many times in a workplace, whether this is for profit, not for profit, volunteer or not, there are implied values all over the place, and people are creating their own boundaries and limitations all of the time. And I guess one of the things that as leaders we want to do is not restrict people, but open up those boundaries so that people can go places they haven't gone before, and the organization can go where it has not gone before.
Well, that raises a great point, Robert, because I was thinking again about the framework, right? So we're not talking about people in a bar, like guys in a bar. We're not talking about the guys in the stands, the guys across the world who've got some opinion about what's going on. There is what we're speaking about is a construct within a very specified environment. There is the group that does have, they are understood to be the ones to say, to create the values to begin with, and then to fundamentally be the adjudicator of what's reasonable or not. And then they're delegating to someone or someone's, but their delegation is also specific. It's not in isolation, just random in the world. They're actually delegating to someone who is hired with a particular accountability and responsibility. So one thing that this brings up for me when a board is writing policy, or governing agencies are writing laws, what are their assumed values that aren't being articulated, or what might be already the values that are existing organizationally that are not being articulated, to which they're assuming are going to be taken into account, but unspecified could leave them open for a different range of interpretation of somebody being able to do whatever. So there's it's operating inside a system already that could have subtle assumed values or assumed perspectives or assumed accountability or roles that people have that they're assuming is going to help shape what's going on? And do those also need to get articulated or at least acknowledged and cleared out?
Yeah.
And do you want to answer your own question?
I would say yes, as far as doing that. But I'm also struck by that, as far as being a board member, right? Being a board member who's part of doing policy with a CEO who has essentially been there for some 28 years, you can't help but be, who you're delegating to. And when you start receiving monitoring reports, you can't help but be influenced by who the person is, what's happened in the past, right? And I keep catching myself in that, where I'm beginning to think now as a seated board member, that as the future continues to happen, what if that person is ever replaced, where have we gotten ourselves in a world of assumption, because there's some level of assuming where somebody's coming from or his track record, and you have somebody new. What do you need to be alert to?
And you're talking about an organization of which you've been a part for a long time. I think one of the things that makes this conversation really interesting is that when we're talking about policy, there's a sense that a policy is a fairly static thing, and yet we are talking about organizations, and the whole purpose of having these organizations, whether they're incorporated or not, whether they have employees or not, whether they're volunteer or not, the whole purpose is because you want some change, you want some result in the community. This is a very dynamic environment, and what you're really trying to do is guide and direct that so that some kind of vision is achieved, and it's achieved in an appropriate manner. So we really are talking about changing our community, and we're also talking about working together. So it's all part of the communication of that achievement.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you were getting at
Yeah,
in any way, Linda?
it's definitely a living, ongoing mechanism. Not that you've created a policy to begin with and then it's there for perpetuity. That it really does need to be reassessed, and that's why we end up reviewing policies to begin with. Is this still appropriate given the current demographic of the ownership, given whoever it is that we're delegating this to? Is this still aligned, and is this still going to allow for a range of possible interpretations that we still are willing to live with any reasonable interpretation that comes back to us? You could have a complete shift in ownership. I don't have an example of that, but suppose your ownership is like a completely different demographic, or it alters dramatically. To have to revisit, is this really what we're saying? But it also, what begins to emerge from this is really the responsibility and the onus of the governing board, the group that is actually creating the policy documents, to what attention needs to be given to that. Because that's the precision of that is really going to be allowing for whatever else happens, and whether that's going to be a match to those owners' interests being realized. And I think generally, we come up with things. I'm just sort of present to this in the climate of things that are happening in the United States, and how many people think they know what it takes to be a statesman or a president, for that matter. There's some like, well, it's what there's. I think this discussion, I even more just appreciate what it takes to be in the role of being one of a group, not as an individual, but as a board, being a singular noun, that what this group says is going to have a dramatic impact on where resources are going, the ultimate result that's happening, and whether that really is a match for who it is that we represent. And there's a whole field of, I think we might be addressing this at some point in another blab, but it's interesting how that comes up again in our discussion. But this aspect of what it is to be a statesman, is that a lost art, a lost, or it hasn't become very distinct, that it can get merged with something else. And I speak about that no matter what the organization is, right? Whether you're talking about government, national government, state government, local government, corporate or nonprofit, but that those who serve on a board and that entire entity is in a particular arena of needing to transcend your own thinking, be looking bigger than yourself, being precise about what you're saying in service of someone for something happening. And I think that's a hugely disciplined, professional, and to the most degree, perhaps a lost skill. One that's gotten collapsed and merged with a bunch of other stuff that isn't that.
Maybe it's a skill that fades and returns from time to time. I think history, for me, would suggest that statesmanship comes and goes. It's available to everyone, but not everyone chooses to practice it. But it's kind of like a reasonable interpretation. If you've got an unreasonable board, you can get away with an unreasonable interpretation, probably. But if your board is reasonable, then the delegatee needs to be very mindful of the fact that the board is going to seriously challenge their interpretation if it's outside of the boundaries that the board, or they feel the board has set. And you need boards fade in and out of being reasonable and unreasonable. Statesmanship fades in and out. Circumstances have a huge say in this, I think. So we find that courts reinterpret the law. If a law was cast 100 years ago and it's still a current law, the courts will consider the circumstances in which Parliament set that law and whether that continues to be reasonable. So even a board that inherits stuff, or a chief executive who inherits stuff from his or her board that has been in existence for a long time, there's nothing to say that it's sacred. One of the downsides, I think, of the long-serving board and the long-serving CEO is that you get into a different kind of groupthink, but it's still a groupthink, and therefore constantly needs to be challenged. I don't mean change the board every 5 minutes, but the board needs, if the board is conscious of that, then the board can challenge itself, because the interpretation we made last time can be said to be fine because that's how we interpreted it last time. But is it reasonable now?
But the board won't do that if they don't put it on the agenda, John. Is that correct?
I agree.
Yeah. And I think everything that we're talking about here, it makes no difference. It doesn't matter unless those who are in the positions are operating consistent with what they're there for. I mean, if you've got people with a political agenda, or they've got, it's going to go this way, and here's how, and either from the person speaking, the board speaking, or the person creating the reasonable interpretation, we're assuming in our conversation here that they're operating, they're honoring what they're there for.
Sure.
Right? Which is in human existence always the bit of a wild card. But I think to outline how critical that is, and obviously for all of us in any work that we've done from advising organizations, I think I know my experience is there's always some dynamic of people actually getting who they are when they're in the position that they are.
Yep.
And I would say just from the nature of the roles, the difference of the roles between governing and managing, or being the chief executive officer, there are different motivations involved. And for example, a board member becomes a board member and wants to be part of an organization because of a belief in the mission, the vision, the values, all of that sort of thing. And certainly the CEO signs on to that when he or she joins the organization, but at the same time, the CEO has different agency, right? They've got to keep the boat afloat. That person is responsible for ensuring that the ship is appropriately manned and staffed and has all the provisions that it needs. So the agency of that is a lot different from the agency of what the board is concerned with, which is that the ship gets to where it's supposed to go and delivers what it's supposed to. So they are operating in a different state of mind, and so I think that's important to point out, because it's not as though the person, like you were saying, Linda, it's not as though the long-term CEO is someone who's operating at odds with what the board wants, but they're operating from different planes of consciousness in terms of what's possible.
Our time is clicking away here, Robert. Are you going to say some closing prayers?
Well, you're quite right. We are approaching the top of the hour, and I'm wondering if anybody has any last comments about reasonable interpretation that just must be said before we wind this up. John, do you have something?
Only improper, so I'll save it.
Oh, now everybody wants to know what you have to say.
It was whether I should seek guidance on coveting my neighbour's wife's ass.
I'm not sure I'm glad I asked.
You asked.
Linda?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Robert.
Sherry?
No, I said what I had to say in terms of the differences between a delegator and a delegatee. So
we've been talking about reasonable interpretation, and I am joined in this particular event by John Bruce in the UK, Linda Steer in North Carolina, and Sherry Jennings in Washington, United States. My name is Robert Ballantyne for the Xylem Group. We'll see you next week. And to find out what we're going to be talking about, please go to xylem-group.com, where we post the information. In fact, the blab has been set up, and you're welcome to go there right now and subscribe to it. Until next week, thank you all very much. We'll be back to talk to you soon. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.